Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. The session is, of course, as you know, about Sunil's wonderful book, Incarnations, but also, by extension, about India's history from ancient to modern. For those of you who are yet to read this book, Incarnations allows you access to India's history through the lives of 50 historical characters, which include political leaders, of course, but also spiritual leaders, artists, musicians, photographers, poets, entrepreneurs, scientists, what have you. And what Sunil manages to do in this book is that he, at least to my mind, rather bravely steps across stringent academic lines of schools of history and period specializations to give us quick but very illuminating glimpses into these fascinating lives. I love this book because Sunil has a knack for storytelling, which is very, very important when you're trying to sum up such glorious lives, or at least really big lives, in just about 2,000 odd words. He has a knack for storytelling. He has an eye for for detail, the kind of details that he picks up on, and also the facets that he chooses to focus on from rather vast lives is what goes a long way into making it the sort of page turner that it is. So with that very short introduction, I'm going to start asking Sunil a couple of questions. Sunil's spoken a bit about this book earlier, so what we thought for this session is that I'm going to ask him a couple of questions about how this book came to be, but very quickly I'd like to move on to the characters that he profiles in this book and hopefully talk more in detail about them. Hello, Sunil. Okay, so a lot of what you perhaps set out to do with this book is summed up by the title that you chose for it, Incarnations. How did you pick that title?
Well, let me first say how happy I am to be doing this conversation with you, because you're a writer and a journalist whose writing I've long admired, and going into subjects that are quite difficult to deal with. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about this in your company. The title does sum up some of the intentions behind the book. In the first instance, it's in the simplest sense, it's really this attempt to bring these lives from past history, often from very dim, distant history, alive. So in that sense, incarnations, to sort of find a way to bring them to life. But it's also, what I hope the title alerts people to, is the interest in the book in the afterlives of these figures. So these are almost all figures from Indian history who were not just significant in their own particular historical moment, but have also at different times in Indian history been picked up again and used for present-day purposes at that moment. And that's one of the things I was very interested in, the relationship between the actual lived historical lives and then their subsequent uses. And often what I saw again and again as I looked at these figures, the vast gap between the historical record of how the life was lived and the subsequent purposes to which they were put. And the intention is not necessarily to be iconoclastic or to suggest that just because there's that gap, present-day uses are totally misguided. Of course, one of the significances of these lives is that they have that rich meaning to them, which can allow them to be used for different purposes. And I think that's what makes them powerful and important in Indian history. So I wanted to get at that sense that how these lives get used and repurposed for present-day battles. So whether it's a life like the Buddha or so many of these figures who are used in a variety of different purposes after their lives.
And also, in a sense, these are, this is what sort of, you pick up on details, like I was saying earlier, you pick up on facets that are fascinating to you. So in a sense, they're also your incarnations. of these characters, right?
That's right. I mean, I really wanted to make it clear that this is not an encyclopedia. These are not the stories I tell are based on the historical record. They're based on facts, but they're very much my readings. These are essays, and they are, in a sense, my own incarnations of these lives. So I fasten on aspects that interest me and that I think do reveal some larger theme or larger argument, some of the fundamental lines of conflict in Indian history, which I think these lives can help us to illuminate in different ways.
Was your process of research any different from your usual process when you're writing books, or you're working on projects? And did you have any sort of influences when it came to the form or the genre of the book?
Well, the process certainly was different in the sense that up to now I had really basically written books using other documents and other texts. Of course, I used a lot of those for this book, but I also was drawing on other kinds of sources. I mean, I dabbled in archaeological research and in the use of images and paintings and that kind of source. And also what I did for this book was really travel virtually to every place where the figures that I write about had some connection. And that's also because this was also a radio series, and a podcast series. So we were recording in these different physical locations. So I think that was actually, I found very illuminating, being in the landscape, in the case of the more recent figures, visiting sometimes their houses, the actual places that they thought and worked and acted in. But in the case of the earlier figures, just even being able to see the landscape. So for example, with Basavana, the Kannada poet and social critic from the 11th century, going to the river where he lived and wrote, and seeing the junction of the two rivers, the description of that becomes a refrain in all his poetry. And actually just seeing that really does have a huge impact and does enter into, I hope, into the way I wrote that essay as well.
You also include ordinary voices. You interview experts, of course, for the book, but you also every once in a while include ordinary voices of people who are maybe in some of these places. For example, at Shivaji's fort, there's this group of this corporate junket that's visiting the fort, and again in Vijayanagar, what used to be the Vijayanagar Empire. So that was a slightly unusual choice, and at least it struck me as an unusual choice. What made you decide to do that?
Yeah, well, again, it was this interest in seeing how these lives are seen today by ordinary people, if you like. I mean, people who happen to be at these sites or are in the town where this famous figure is from. And I was interested in getting those sorts of responses and showing through those voices of people today, how they see these figures. In some cases, of course, they had no recollection of them at all. I write about a figure called Chidambaram Pillai, who was a Tamil lawyer and nationalist at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And there's a port named the Pillai port, but no one knows. He's a forgotten figure, entirely forgotten figure, because in a sense he was a loser in the nationalist struggle. He was imprisoned for about 8 years, and then Gandhi came after him and sort of basically took over the nationalist movement. So Pillai is forgotten. So I wanted to, in a sense, test the memory of these figures as well by asking people, what does this mean to you?
Like you mentioned, Sunil, and like is well commonly known, in India, well, across the world, but in India perhaps particularly, history is a sort of political battleground, and a lot of the characters that you write about have been taken over, appropriated by political parties, by leaders, for their own particular political agenda, and sometimes without regard to historical fact. One such figure would perhaps be Vivekanand. And it's interesting because you write about, one of the things that you talk about is the sort of duality, and both the duality and the ambiguity of Vivekananda's message. And you contextualize you talk about the time when he was coming up with these ideas that he was coming up with, and this was sort of just pre-nationalism in that sense, the rise of just before the rise of nationalism, and yet today he's sort of this poster boy for Hindu nationalism. Would you like to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Vivekananda is actually a very good example of our sort of over-investment in the mythic conception of a figure and our under-investment in the actual historical reality of those figures. And as you say, I mean, he's now become a poster boy. He's a hero to our current Prime Minister. And he's been really, I think, simplified into a kind of icon of Hindu nationalism. Whereas what strikes me about Vivekananda, and he's an extremely complicated figure, and one who, much more than being a celebrant of Hinduism and Hindu religion and philosophy, was a really deep critic of it. I mean, he's a critic of the Hindu scriptures. He's a critic of Hindu practices. He's someone who's deeply influenced by his experience of the West and living in the West. He was very struck by the egalitarianism that he experienced in America, particularly the way in which women had a much higher status in America and the West than they did in India. And he takes all these ideas and becomes a really profound social critic of our society. At the same time, he does think he's a reformer. So he's not someone who rejects Hinduism, but he thinks that there's a big work of reform to be done in the religion. And he's not a nationalist thinker at all. I mean, he dies in 1902, which is 3 years before the start of the Swadeshi movement in Bengal and in Maharashtra as well, which is really the first mass nationalist movement in India. So he's not around when nationalism kicks off. And he's really much more a universalist thinker, I think, trying to critique Indian society on the basis of universalist principles like equality, like a conception of tolerance as well. And he's also someone who psychologically is a very, to use the word, sort of conflicted figure. I mean, he's very attracted by many of the things in the West. And so I think he's someone who we really need to recognize the ambiguity and ambivalence of, and not allow these easy captures of reputation. So, what I say in the book is what I try to do is to sort of demythologize some of these figures in order to rehumanize them. And I think by humanizing them, you actually see what's remarkable about them, as what the scale of their achievement is, and what the internal struggles and also external social struggles that they're engaged with are about, and how they manage to move beyond those. Whereas if you see them as these superhuman figures, well, of course they're going to do superhuman things. I mean, there's no tension in trying to explain that or understand that.
No, that's definitely one of the greatest things about the book, because as time has gone on, all we remember Vivekananda for is that we've reduced him to that one address in Chicago, perhaps, and this sort of champion of Hindu religion, but this duality that you speak of at home and abroad, and the context in which all of this was coming, and the fact that he was thinking through a lot of things, and he died very young, and he was still sort of perhaps in the process of figuring out where he really believes, what he really believes in. But to go back to also another figure who's been perhaps more controversial than Vivekananda is Shivaji, and another, again, of course, Hindu nationalist icon. And you talk about Shivaji in your book, in your podcast. The story of Shivaji is the story of many different things, of caste strife, of caste strife, of opportunistic alliances, like that guy says, who calls him a networker, which is such an interesting word to use for Shivaji, but that's what he really was in a sense. And the fact that a lot, perhaps he was also motivated, amongst other things, by a desire for social ascension, right? Because coming from his mother, coming from a higher caste than his father, and then the fallout between the mother and the father, all of that. Then a singular narrative of a Hindu king challenging the Muslim rule, right? I want you to talk a little bit about that, but also perhaps your view on how he's come to be this very touch-me-not figure in Indian history.
Yeah, again, I mean, he's a really fascinating example, and I think that's right. He's been simplified, as you suggest, into being this mascot of Hindu resistance to Mughal and Muslim rule, and of course, that's part of what he was engaged in. But what really struck me about when I looked at his life was this way in which he is determined to rise, not just to acquire greater military power, not just to expand his territory, but to rise in the social order. So he's born effectively from a lowly caste, a Kunbi caste, who are not traditionally rulers. So one of the things that I was very struck by, we have a very detailed description and account of his own self-coronation, which he did in 1674 in the fort of Raigarh, his main fort. And it's an account which was written by an Indian officer of the East India Company. And what Shivaji does there is he goes back to an ancient ceremony called the Abhishek, which is really to anoint a king, and he, it says, hires Brahmins to change his caste status, to raise him to a Kshatriya status, so that he can become this, the Chhatrapati, the sort of ruler of rules, and that in itself, that ceremony has now become a subject of great controversy. Many supporters of Shivaji, followers, would deny it because they see it as a way of ceding, that he was ceding power to the Brahmins, and that was not what Shivaji was about. But I think when you look at these complex moments and you see that this was a guy who was having to struggle against his own social order as much as he was having to fight the Mughals, as it were. He was engaged with struggles with his own people. And that, I think, is a very interesting aspect to bring out. And I think, one of the things I say in the essay about Shivaji, it's not just that he was drawing on the Brahmins to raise him in the caste order, but it's almost as if he was showing them, look, I can buy you to do this for me. I am actually, you may be more powerful than me in a status sense, but I can actually pay you to elevate me. So there's a kind of complex relationship of power going on there. And what also struck me today is, and you alluded to this, when I was going around the various forts that he has in the Deccan, it's a destination now for corporate days out. And so company groups go there for bonding, and also for taking Shivaji as an example of social success and business success. So a number of people I was speaking to exactly used this word, but Shivaji was a great networker. We bring people here to understand how history works, and Shivaji is an example for us. So this was not about a warrior example. This was an example of someone who made a social success of his life, and that's an aspect that I think often gets forgotten. And again, complicates the way in which he can be appropriated simply as a warrior against the Mughals. And even on that front, I mean, what's really important to see is that he was a complete opportunist and pragmatist on that front too. So he would ally with whomever he needed to in order to further his goals. And some of his targets were Hindu Maratha chieftains as well. So it wasn't religion purely that drove his military approach either.
Another ruler that comes to mind in this context is Krishnadeva Raya, who you also write about. And he's also sort of, in recent times at least, become very important to the Hindu nationalist mythology. And in fact, I believe, even Naipaul sort of saw him as this ruler of this sort of last Hindu outpost, resisting, Mughal, at least, Muslim rule, not just Mughal rule, but Muslim rule. And yet you talk about the Vijayanagar Empire as this cosmopolitan empire, and that's, I believe, the word you use, cosmopolitan, which is a very, very interesting and way to describe it. And so, how do you reconcile these two ideas?
Well, again, Krishna Devaraya is someone who you can understand so much better once you go to visit the site of Hampi and Vijayanagar, and you see the architectural styles, particularly from his era. And you see that these are architectural styles that are not defined by one religious tradition. There's what art historians call the Sultanate style in which he built. And he was very much, again, sometimes fighting against, but sometimes fighting with other Muslim rulers of the time. But what he saw himself being was an imperial ruler, not just a king, but actually an emperor. And that meant being an emperor of all the subjects under his command, whatever religion they belonged to. And so even the titles that are attached to Krishna Devaraya from his time, he's described, for instance, one of the titles that he has is he's called a sultan over Hindu kings. Or another title that is used to describe him is the Lord who established the kingdom of the Muslims. So he was seen as a protector of all religious groups. And it was very important to his own self-image that he wasn't a king just of the Hindus or an emperor just of he was an emperor of all his subjects. And that, I mentioned in the book, Naipaul goes to visit Hampi in the late 80s, at the time when Naipaul is getting kind of fired up by the rise of a kind of resurgent Hindu self-confidence and then nationalism. And when Naipaul is describing his walking around Vijayanagar, it's really this sense that, here was the last great Hindu resistance against the Mughals, and after this it was all bleakness and darkness. And actually, that's not what Krishna Devaraya was about at all. He was about drawing on these different traditions and influences and establishing himself as the king of all his subjects. And again, if you look at descriptions of Vijayanagar at the time that Krishna Devaraya lived in the early 17th century, 16th century and 17th century, the descriptions are all about the varieties of different people who lived there. If you look at the friezes and the sculptural motifs, sculptural carvings in Vijayanagar, you see a variety of different costumes, of different headdresses. And it's almost as if they wanted to emphasize this diversity within the society rather than standing for one religion or one tradition.
On the other hand, you also, in your profile of Akbar, not so directly, but if one reads it carefully, you challenge this idea of Akbar being a sort of proto-liberal by contextualizing his interest in the different religions that he was interested in. And that's one of the many profiles that I wish had gone on for a little bit longer. So would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, what I'm interested in this book is in a sense, trying to puncture some of the conventional readings held both by liberals but also by anti-liberals or non-liberals or whatever terms you want to use. So it's not, in that sense, I think, there are illusions on every side of the political spectrum. And Akbar, I think, is a good example of this. He's often, as you say, celebrated as, the great, tolerant, secular, proto-liberal ruler in India. Indeed, Amartya Sen partly sort of portrays him in this light too. And actually, when you look at Akbar and why he was interested in these diverse religions and why he had a court that was so open to them, well, there are two things to say. One, it's true that he never tried to impose Islam on his subjects. That's absolutely true, and that's a wise, pragmatic choice in recognition that, it was simply impossible to do that. But his interest in the variety of different religions, which he pursues by inviting scholars and devouts from all the different religions to debate in his court, it's not so much that he's an open-minded guy who wants to he's interested in debate. But what was happening at the time was that he was living at the moment when the first Islamic millennium was coming in the last decade of the 16th century. And there were many sort of apocalyptic stories about what was going to happen. And one argument being made was that a new religion would emerge after the millennium, and in a sense, Akbar saw himself as being the creator and then also the object of this new religion, which he imagined would be a synthesis of all the existing religions. So aspects of Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, his own religion, and others. And indeed, the court, Akbar's court, creates this religion of the Din-e-Ilahi, which is this new religion of the court. And so it was a religious impulse that was driving his interest in the diversity of religious beliefs, in the hope that he could somehow draw them all together and create this new religious faith. So I think it's important to remember that. And again, that's a point about context, that we can't read back into history our own preferences and just have our own safe genealogies. We do need to see the way in which we can't just appropriate them.
Absolutely, and read motivations out of context. But moving from medieval to modern history, one of the things that one of the myths that you also address is this of Nehru and Bose's rivalry, which has, of course, been rather farcically in the news in recent times as well. And you end that story, towards the end of that story of Bose's story, you make a very interesting connection to the non-aligned movement. Would you like to talk a little bit about the turning points in Nehru and Bose's relationship in particular, and of course Bose in general?
Yeah, I mean, Subhash Chandra Bose is a fascinating figure, and again, has become a figure of multiple appropriations in his own Bengal, across the nation, as this great symbol of martial power. In a sense, he represents the thing that the national movement really seems to have not had, which was a commitment to the use of force. And I think that's what set him against not just Nehru, but of course against Gandhi. I mean, the other big rivalry within the national movement was between Bose and Gandhi, and that's also an interesting relationship. And I think in that relationship, we see Gandhi using his typical method, which is when someone opposes Gandhi, he doesn't get rid of them or send them away. He tries to kind of smother them with his own love, so sort of asphyxiate them by drawing them into his embrace. So he says, "Okay, Bose, Subhash, you don't like what I do. Come and be president of the Congress. You come and tell us what to do." And so he invites him to be even closer to him. In the end, of course, they do split, and Bose then is pushed out of the presidentship of the Congress. But what's interesting, the reason I made that connection between Bose's fascination with hard power and Nehru's move towards non-alignment is this, that Bose, throughout his life, is looking for alliances in order to try and win India's freedom. So he, in the first instance, when the Second World War breaks out, he sees this as the great moment of opportunity for India's freedom. And this is the moment to ally with the Nazis. So, as many of you will know, as I write about in the essay, he makes this incredible escape from British prison in Calcutta, travels across Afghanistan in disguise, disguised as an Italian, and ends up in Berlin, and waits for months to meet with Hitler. And when he does, he realizes that Hitler is racist and is not really that interested in supporting Indian freedom. So then he goes on this, again, completely madcap, harebrained submarine trip to Japan to try and get the Japanese to ally with him to defeat India. And then he gets set up in Singapore. And what you see in this is this pursuit of alliances in India's interests. And I think one of the lessons that people like Nehru and others after drew was that actually alliances were not a good path to take. That at the end of the day, these bigger, just to end this, Bose's pursuit of alliances, at the very end of his life, after Japan is defeated, he actually dies trying to fly to the Soviet Union because he wants then to join with them to defeat the British. So throughout, he's in pursuit of these great power alliances. And I think what Nehru and others saw was that actually great power alliances were not a good path for India to take, because at the end of the day, the great powers just follow their own interests and dispense with India. So what I was trying to suggest in that essay was that, in a sense, the lesson of Bose's life gets, in some ways, internalized in India's post-independence strategy of non-alignment, of not to be allied with the great powers, through a recognition that alliances would in the end mean a subordination of India's interests. So that seems to me a more interesting way of thinking about Bose's legacy for us than simply, the lost martial hero who could have led India to a different kind of future.
Before we move on, two things that come to mind when you were talking about this. One is that Nehru, and you've spoken about this in other interviews, you get this question a lot, why was Nehru not one of the 50? But even though Nehru is not one of the 50, as is expected, he makes a sort of cameo in many other profiles. And when I was reading through these stories and not looking at Nehru from the lens of the hero, which is the usual lens employed to look at him, or the principal character rather, the one phrase that came to my mind through these cameos is that Nehru was a sort of reasonable man. That was one thing that could be said about him. What would your view be?
Well, not everyone would agree with that. I mean, Sheikh Abdullah wouldn't agree with that.
Sheikh Abdullah would definitely not agree with that.
And he figures a lot in the essay on Sheikh Abdullah. But that said, you're absolutely right. Nehru isn't one of the 50. And, I wanted to have a few surprising choices or non-choices. So that was one that I thought I would keep him out. But he does appear in a number of the other essays. Beginning with Ashoka, he's in the essay on Ashoka, and he comes through again and again in different essays through the book. In a sense, he's a little bit like kind of Hitchcock in his own movies. He kind of has this kind of walk-on part, and if you recognize him here and there, but. The point about him being a reasonable man, I mean, that's an interesting point, because, that when we say someone is a reasonable man, it usually means they're kind of dull and boring and banal. And there is a way in which, Nehru, when you place him amongst his colleagues, and we've mentioned some of them, but he looks so much a kind of moderate figure. You have a Gandhi, or you have a Subhash Chandra Bose, or you have an Ambedkar, or you have a Periyar, or you have these really extreme figures. These figures who pursue extremities in their own moral life, in their own political choices, in their own social critique. And Nehru is not like that. Nehru is kind of always saying, there's a more moderate way to think about this. And I think that is actually one of his strengths. That in an age of extremes, as the historian Eric Hobsbawm referred to it, he did actually try and take a more moderate path. And in an age when the pursuit of extreme ideas and ideologies destroyed societies, absolutely destroyed societies. I think actually we as a nation have something to be thankful for the boring and the moderate and the reasonable that Nehru did try to pursue. The ability not to be seduced by the temptations of alliances with the great powers, the ability not to be seduced by the temptations of a simple ideological program to try and push through society, whether it was, nationalization or collectivization or whatever, not to be seduced by the simple, big, bold answer. And of course, today that's a subject of much criticism. Why wasn't something pushed harder? But actually, not pushing or not pulling entirely on the levers of power that you have, operating at a gear or two below the power that you have, actually can be sometimes a very wise political choice.
Boring, moderate, and reasonable are not the descriptors that come to mind when one talks about his daughter, and you have taken up what seems to me rather formidable challenge of trying to sum up Indira's legacy as well in 2,000 odd words. And you say at some point that despite herself, she managed to perhaps deepen and make democracy more accessible for the ordinary Indian. Would you like to explain that?
Yeah, again, partly what I was interested in thinking about her life is with so many of these lives, the way their legacy is much more paradoxical than we sometimes allow. Both I mentioned, but the paradoxes which escape an easy appropriation. So, Indira Gandhi is, of course, the great villain of the intelligentsia and the political elite today. She is the one who most undermined and challenged democracy and rights in India. But what's striking to me is, perhaps quite, and indeed certainly quite unintentionally, one of the effects of her attack on constitutional rights and democracy, her suspension of that during the emergency, was actually to deepen the commitments of Indians to democracy. Before her time, those on the left would dismiss democracy as bourgeois democracy. It wasn't real democracy, it was a false kind of system. Those on the right also saw it as a kind of, pale secular version, etc., not the real thing. But after the emergency, both the right and the left deepen their commitment to it, see it as being something really important. Not least, and beyond just the political parties, Indian voters see it for the first time that they can actually vote someone out of power. And I think that does herald the sharp rise in participation that we began to see from the 1980s onwards. It prompted the arms of government like the courts to become much more activist. It regenerated sort of civil society. So the 1980s and 1990s were the decades of the rise of NGOs and civil society organizations. And it made people more skeptical of the state and wanting to hold it more accountable. So in that sense, I think the unintended outcome of Indira Gandhi's suspension and attack of democracy was actually to make us more aware of how valuable it is to us, and in that sense to deepen it.
There's every now and then, particularly in the last 1.5 years, we hear alarm bells about another emergency. And while that may or may not be, well, at least to my mind, I'm not sure how likely it is, but what's really interesting is that you go to the heart of what was sort of behind emergency, and you manage to pinpoint this, what you call, I think, the Jacobean instinct, to use a decisive electoral victory, which is one facet of democracy, to undermine other facets of democracy, whether they were institutions or courts, which is, well, not a facet of democracy, but it's sort of facet of republic. And that, deep as the democracy is today, do you feel that that is something that might is still a possibility in the life of India.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point, because it's not just that she deepens, one of the effects of her rule is to deepen it, it's also to simplify it. She simplifies democracy, and it's that simplified version that I think now is really playing itself out. And by that I mean, as you exactly say, with her, she draws on what I call this Jacobin conception of democracy, which dates back to the French Revolution, which is that somehow a ruler or a leader can incarnate the people. That if I have the popular vote behind me, if I have a popular victory that I can call is my own, I can ignore all the other institutions that are there to check my power and speak in the name of the people. And that's certainly something that she very much did. She, as I describe in the essay, she breaks down the structure of federalism in the Indian polity. She shunts aside the state-level Congress leadership, and all in the name of a direct relationship to the people. That I am your leader, you don't need these middlemen, you don't need these chief ministers. And one has heard those echoes today, of course, everywhere, where leaders emerge who claim a direct relationship to the electorate. And that is absolutely not how Indian democracy was conceived in the 1940s and 50s. It was conceived as a constitutional democracy, as a model where you had the different branches of government, and no one branch, neither judiciary, nor the executive, nor the legislative, could claim to be the full representative of the people. But in a sense, India, we the people, as the Constitution says, but there was no one moment that could incarnate that, no one leader, no one institution. It was divided across these different institutions, and it was their working in combination which was the expression of the sovereign will of the people. And I think with Mrs. Gandhi, we get the breakdown of that image of power, that image of democratic power. And of course, today, now it's become the standard way that, I won the vote, so now I can do whatever I want. So there's an over-attention to the winning of power and a lack of attention to the use of power. That's very, I think, symptomatic of our politics today. So you'll do anything to win power. But once you win power, you then can go on to do anything. There's no accountability. And I think, so the obsession with elections and with the winning of power has, I think, been a dangerous simplification of how we understand democracy.
Indira Gandhi is one of the few, sorry, we have 15 more minutes left? Okay. Okay, then I'm going to, I think, you've spoken about this, so you can Google Sunil's other interviews, and I'm going to skip this question about why he couldn't feature more women in his book. But what he does do is he talks about gender issues through some of the male characters that he's writing about. And I was sort of fascinated by his choice of writing about Tagore and there are many things that can be said about Tagore. He had, again, one of those vast lives, but he talks about Tagore principally as a sort of feminist writer who's committed to the idea of personal freedom at a time when it might have seemed like a sort of unimportant concern to other freedom fighters or nationalists. What made you, what drew you to this aspect of his life and his writings? And you, of course, also wonderfully contextualize, where this might be coming from, where his personal life is concerned.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, as you said, the fact that in my book there's 6 essays about women, but that doesn't mean those are the only 6 essays in which I talk about issues that are important and relevant to women in India. The theme runs right through the book, from the Buddha, the essay on the Buddha, to Mahavir, to Guru Nanak, to Periyar, and on right through. And also, many of the voices many of the best scholars and artists and others that I talk to and use in the book are women. whether it's Ramana Thapa or Arundhati Roy or Bharati Kher or Shilpa Gupta and so on. So I hope that the presence of things that are, of all those issues that are important to thinking about women in Indian history are running through the book. Tagore, for me, was very interesting in the sense that he is, of course, again seen as the great national poet, the nationalist poet in some ways. But he was, of course, also one of our greatest critics of nationalism. And the position from which he criticized nationalism was the position of individual and personal freedom. He was constantly reminding us that the point of national independence was individual freedom. That unless we could guarantee and build that, it was not worth it. And what I find in his writings is that he's constantly concerned with the constraints on individuality in India. And he examines that through the lives of women, particularly in his novels, in his plays, in his poetry, and in his letters. It's the way in which women's choices are constrained, particularly in the realm of love. That women don't get to choose whom they can be with, because families decide who they marry and so on. And in fact, I begin the Tagore essay with it's actually in Washington, on the day the US Supreme Court gives the judgment for same-sex marriage. Because I think that's a very Tagorean value, the ability to choose whom you love. It's the most intimate choice in our individual freedom that we can have. And it's one that we systematically have denied, not just socially, but today even legally, because of the unwillingness to repeal Section 377 in India. So that was what I wanted to bring out in the Tagore piece.
I think I'm sure we don't have much time. I would have loved to ask you a question about Jinnah that was on my mind, but I think I'm going to quickly end with asking you a question that links back to where we started, which is Incarnations. And you do draw very interesting connects between these lives that you're writing about, their particular historical context, and the incarnations in which they exist today. And two of those lives are Birsa Munda and Buddha. And they exist in their current incarnations as part of two related but sort of also distinct socio-political struggles in India that are very, very important socio-political struggles in India. Even if that's not how they are seen in the current times. If you could quickly talk about that.
Sure. I mean, the Buddha and Birsa Munda are, I think, two perfect examples of ways in which lives get appropriated for different purposes. I mean, the essay on the Buddha begins in a slum in Mumbai, in a Dalit temple to the Buddha. And, what I try to show there is that he's the first historical individual we can identify in Indian history. And, for about 1,000 years after his death, many parts of India were essentially Buddhist. But then he disappears. He's suppressed first by a Brahminic reaction and then by Muslim rule. But he explodes back into 20th century Indian history through Ambedkar. And he becomes the great figure of social equality in India, and the great voice, the great critic of the caste order. And so the Buddha, for me, is a perfect example of this process of incarnation across time. Birsa Munda is a very different life. Born in 1875, he was born to the Kol tribe, the Adivasis of India today, which are, in number terms, are as large as, say, a country like Germany or Vietnam. 80 million plus Adivasis. And I mean, this is a remarkable life, growing up in the forest, becoming a healer, and then becoming essentially the leader of a political movement. He was educated by missionaries, but he takes on not just the British colonial state and the missionaries, but also the Indian middlemen who were kind of coming in and encroaching on Adivasi land and rights. And he, in the end, his life, he loses. He dies in prison. He's 25 years old. But he's been appropriated today as a kind of nationalist figure, someone who resisted the British. And that's so absolutely untrue to the record, because he was fighting again other Indians as much as he was fighting the British and the missionaries. And indeed, the struggles that he was involved in for the rights of land and control of land for the Adivasis are precisely the struggles that are underway today. And it's very telling. So his portrait is now in Parliament in Delhi. And there's only one image we have of Birsa Munda, and it was taken when he was captured by the British. And it's a prison photograph, essentially a mugshot with him in handcuffs. And the portrait in Parliament is based on that image, except the handcuffs have been airbrushed out. And for me, that's a kind of, precise example of the way we airbrush and Photoshop so much of the stories of some of these figures in order to suit our present purposes. And we don't acknowledge the tensions and internal challenges that they pose to us still.
That's a lovely way to put it. I think we'll still be able to get in a couple of questions. Okay, so over there, is there a mic?
Good evening, sir. So, in the history of the nation, history of India...
Could you speak up a bit?
In the history of the society which India is constituted as, we have always been considered as a land which churns ideas. As you said, since the time of Indira Gandhi and post the time of Indira Gandhi, we have come across as a society, as a citizenry, which sees solace in a leader. It can be someone who's Rajiv Gandhi, and it was VP Singh, it was Vajpayee, now it's Prime Minister Modi. But we have always kind of tried to find solace in someone who will come and who will change the world for us, who will be a messiah. I don't think this was the concept in the days before. What I want to know from you is that, do you think it's a recent phenomena, or has India, because it's been considered as a place which used to churn ideas in terms of literature, in terms of science, in terms of technology, and currently we see that India is consistently lacking in those fields in terms of innovation, in terms of new ideas, the way it will stir the world? Do you think it has been because of a phenomena that now we are looking at finding solace in a person? Or has it always been there, and probably now we are lacking just because of lack of dispute?
Sorry, I just want to add to this. This is actually, this is something that you talk about when you talk about Rajaraja Chola, when you make that connect with Jayalalitha eventually. So perhaps you could.
Yeah, I think that there is a kind of, and I don't know if it's only a characteristic of India, but certainly there's this fascination with the great leader. And in fact, it's something that Ambedkar really cautions us against in his speeches in the Constituent Assembly, where he says, beware of your fondness for Mahatmas and great leaders, that we now have to move into the era of institutions and law and procedures rather than to trust individuals and leaders. And I think that is something that, as a growing democracy, we do need to really take that lesson. The great French writer and historian of the 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote about democracy in France, democracy in America, sorry. He makes this point that as a democracy matures, you no longer need great leaders. What you need, what takes their place are institutions. Rather than great leaders. Of course, it's probably not a simple progressive story as we see even in some of the older democracies. There is this sort of movement back and forth to moments when a great leader is seen as a kind of savior. But that's one of the things I wanted to do in this book, is to take some of those great leader figures and to actually show them as human beings. And likewise with someone like Ambedkar, who today, for many people, he is this leader who you can't say anything critical or anything human about. And I wanted to say, precisely, we need to see them as human beings and not just to constantly be burnishing their images.
Over there at the back, please. And then if we can take one in front.
Pragya, you had a question for Sunil
Could you speak up a bit?
You had a question for Sunil on Jinnah. Could you please ask that question, please?
Okay, thank you very much. I owe you one for that, because this is one I really want to hear the answer to. You talk about a lot of miscalculations of Jinnah when it came to the idea of Pakistan. But I think you also quote a historian, Aisha Jalal, as saying that, she's not convinced that he really wanted partition, and he was simply playing. Your profile of his is called the chess player, and he was simply playing chess with the pieces that were on the board that he had at hand, right? Do you subscribe to that? What is your view of?
Jinnah is one of the real enigmas of 20th century Indian history. And one of the things I wanted to underline was that for all but 1 year of his life, he's part of Indian history. We now tend to think of him as, somehow he's part of Pakistan's history. But until August 1947, he's part of Indian history. And he represents a very interesting strand of kind of struggling with liberal ideas in India. How can you protect minorities in a society like India? One of the things that's also I was struck by in doing my work on Jinnah was that he was always fascinated with acting. As a young student in London, he actually wanted to become an actor. He would go and go to the Old Vic and watch Shakespeare and watch speech making. So he was always playing a role in a way. And one of the things that Aisha Jalal, as you say, has argued very cleverly is that Jinnah didn't really want to partition Pakistan. It was a bluff, and he was forced into it by the Congress. So actually, the Indian National Congress is more responsible for partition than Jinnah was. Now, the nice thing about that argument is it annoys everybody. It annoys people in Pakistan because, it undermines the founding quality of Jinnah. It annoys people in India because it's blaming partition on the Congress. Is it entirely true? Well, I don't think it's entirely true. I mean, I think that, Jinnah did get himself into a position where he was kind of pursuing what I call a kind of liberal perfectionism, where you could have a society just of a single homogeneous kind, and that would in a sense be the safest society for all members of that kind. And of course that hasn't turned out to be true, because even within a supposedly single religion, you're not all of the same kind. You have Shias, you have Sunnis, you have Ahmadis, Jinnah himself came from a minority within a minority. He was a Muslim, but he was a Ismaili Khoja, which was a very minority within. So, and once you kind of pursue the line that Jinnah takes, which is that you separate your identity and then you're protected. Actually, what I argue at the end of the essay, and maybe if you'll allow me, I'll just read the last paragraph. No religion, no nation, no community, no individual even is ever one. From the nation all the way down to the individual, identity is prone to secessionism. Jinnah articulated one powerful strand in the dreams of modern nationalism, for homogeneity. But every dream of homogeneity stares at an infinite regress. There's always some aspect of identity, some sect, some culture or language that doesn't fit. To pursue homogeneity is to enter an endless life of purging, secession, and self-destructive violence. And that's really what I think is the lesson of Jinnah that we need to take.
And of course, this is also a powerful argument against, as powerful an argument against the idea of Hindu nationalism as probably constitutional liberalism. But one final question, and sorry, I'll have to give it to you because we haven't had any.
Hi, would it be a very difficult book to write if you were to take leaders who have been demonized and humanize those? So that's one part of the question. The other part is, have you been tempted to take a subaltern view and write about people outside the hegemonic power structure?
Couldn't really get very much.
Was your question, if I correctly understood it, were you asking if there are historical figures that have been demonized, and has he felt the need to correct historical record where they're
to humanize them.
To humanize them?
Yeah, because the theme here seems to have been to humanize people that we have idealized. So would it be very difficult to do it the other way around?
Yeah, I mean, I was not trying either just to be kind of iconoclastic for its own sake, or to and there are certain figures. For example, I take the figure of Krishna Menon. I have an essay on Krishna Menon, who precisely is a figure who is now, everyone's favorite villain in post-independence politics. And actually, what I try to show in that essay is this is a man who, at a personal level, was struggling all through his life with severe depression and mental troubles and illness, and nevertheless played this massively important role in shaping India's foreign policy. So just even at the human level, I think the Krishna Menon story is far more interesting and important. And we need to tell those kinds of stories, not least because, something like mental illness today is such a stigmatized and unspoken subject. But actually, if you start to recognize that there are figures in our history who did suffer that and yet went on to do really remarkable things, I think that in itself is something that enriches how we think of ourselves as a society.
I'm really sorry, that's all the time we have for questions. For what it's worth, I had many more questions that I couldn't ask Sunil. But what this calls for is that you pick up a copy of his book. It's out in paperback now, and Sunil will also be signing copies right outside over here. And perhaps you can chat with him there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you, Sunil.